In APUS history, you'll never have a College Board question ask you, on what date did a specific event occur? However, it is still important to know what happened and when so you can understand the context and flow of events and history in general, and also clearly understand immediate causes and effects of events. Period 3 is chock full of important events that happen on an almost year by year basis. So let's take a brief look at the events before, during, and after the Revolution in chronological order. First, we start off with the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763, which was a war between the two preeminent European empires, Great Britain and France. Native Americans are also in the title, as many Eastern North American tribes participated both against the British and allies with the British. For our focus, we care most about the war and its effects in North America, as the British will defeat the French and take possession of France's eastern North American colonies in the disputed Ohio River Valley. The war is costly, though, and it puts the British government into a significant amount of debt, which will lead to retraction of the salutary neglect policy of the British colonies, as the government became more hands-on in the governing and tax collection in its dominion. One important event that occurs at the beginning of the French and Indian War is a colonial attempt led by Ben Franklin to form a colonial union. Now, they were not thinking independence yet, but they were thinking about a mutual defense as much of the French and Indian War was fought on the frontier of the colonies. The Union also sought to regulate trade with Native Americans, build forts, and provide for a coastal defense. The Union would not come to fruition. However, it did start important conversations about future colonial unity. The end of the French and Indian War in 1763 would impact several other important events. The terms of peace upset Eastern Native American tribes on all sides, who formed a brief coalition and attacked British positions. This led to an infamous and controversial action, which, when during peace negotiations, the British distributed blankets infected with smallpox to the Native Americans. The rebellion died shortly afterwards. The British, looking to further avoid conflict on the frontier, imposed the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbade American colonists from settling across the Appalachian Mountains. This restriction would anger the colonists. Now we're going year by year with the events. In 1764, the British imposed a tax on sugar, and the colonists increasingly opposed the controversial Vice Admiralty courts, as they are seen as hindering the sovereignty the colonists had grown accustomed to. 1765 would prove to be a pivotal year as the British imposed the Stamp Act, which was a tax on many official documents that colonists, especially merchants, despised, and they quickly formed an intercolonial committee called the Stamp Act Congress to formally oppose and protest the act. This also coincided with a boycott of British goods. The following year, the British would repeal the Stamp Act to the delight of the colonists. However, the British did pass the Declaratory Act, stating it still had the power to tax the colonies. And in the following year, the British tried another series of taxes called the Townshend Acts, which imposed taxes on British manufactured goods that colonists imported. This led to another American boycott of British goods in 1768. In 1770, the Townshend Acts are partially repealed. However, violence does break out at a customs house in Boston as peaceful protest, or a drunken mob, depending on your point of view, got into a conflict with a group of stationed British soldiers. Shots were fired and around 5 colonists were killed. The British soldiers were put on trial and were actually defended by the lawyer and later founding father John Adams. The event was highly publicized and used by anti-British patriots as an example of British tyranny against American colonists. Continuing on, intercolonial unity increased as colonial elites increasingly discussed important matters through their committees of correspondence. And then in 1773, another crisis in Boston was sparked as the British passed the Tea Act, and local Bostonian patriots protested the act by dressing up as Native Americans and dumped tea into the Boston harbor. The British government was incensed by this costly destruction of private property and decided to punish Massachusetts with the strict coercive or intolerable acts, which shut down the harbor until the tea was paid for. It also took away political autonomy of the colonial government and called for disarming of Massachusetts militia, of which, when the British attempted to disarm the militia in 1775, the militia instead organized and fought the British in several small-scale pitched battles. At the same time, in 1775, the Second Continental Congress was meeting, and they attempted to defuse the situation with the British government and sent an appeal, an olive branch petition. It went over the heads of Parliament and directly to the king, asking for an easement of tensions by reversing course and repealing the intolerable acts. The king rejected the petition. Next, 1776 is a year every American should know the significance of. It started out with an appeal by Thomas Paine to the masses through his masterfully written Common Sense that made many clear arguments as to why it was absurd to continue to be a colony of Great Britain. Several months later, the Second Continental Congress formally declared independence. The actual fighting part of the Revolution, known as the Revolutionary War, lasted from 1775 to 1783. There are lots of battles, heroics, betrayals, and interesting tactics and policies on both sides. But for APUSH, we tend to just focus on a few key events of the war. One being the Battle of Saratoga, which was an important American victory as it convinced Great Britain's chief rival, the French, that the Americans had a real chance of winning, so they became more involved with providing resources, manpower, ships, and logistical support. A lot more battles and maneuvers happened, which eventually culminates in the Battle of Yorktown, in which a combined American and French force cornered the main British army under the command of General Cornwallis, who surrendered, which ended the major hostilities between the sides. A couple years later, a peace was hammered out in Paris, in which the United States not only achieved recognition of its original 13 colonies, but also the Old Northwest. Now turning to matters of government. The first United States government was the Articles of Confederation, and it did not last long. It was originally written in 1777 and finally adopted in 1781. However, it would be scrapped in 1789 because of a variety of issues which tracked back to the framework of the government under the Articles, which was weak, ineffective, and difficult to amend. A few key examples of its weakness were the inability to resolve foreign debt problems, currency issues, and resolving issues between the states. One particular event that showcased both as a cause and outcome was Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787. There was one success under the Articles of Confederation, which were the Northwest Ordinances, which established the process to admit new states and declared that the Northwest would be free from slavery. Our next government would have staying power. Let's take a look at the timeline of its ratification. In 1787, state leaders, including George Washington, met to discuss the problems of the Articles. They decided to scrap the Articles, and with the aid of intellectual powerhouse James Madison, the Constitution was drafted. It was not the law of the land yet, as the Constitution was sent to the states for ratification. A mark of approval by at least 9 out of the 13 states was set. And over the course of the next 2 years, there was a very public debate between Federalists and Anti Federalists on whether or not to approve the Constitution. Eventually, the Federalists would win out. The Constitution was approved and went into effect in 1789. The new Constitution called for three branches of government, with an executive branch headed by a president. The person that was almost universally approved of for the job was George Washington, who served 2 terms from 1789 to 1797. His presidency was not a smooth one, though, as opposing political forces led by Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson tried to sway Washington to their point of view. Hamilton usually won out and was able to implement his financial plan that included a public credit system and First Bank of the United States. Also in 1791, the promised Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. A few other notable domestic and foreign policy events of Washington's presidency included the successful putting down of a rebellion in western Pennsylvania called the Whiskey Rebellion, which was over the whiskey tax. Also, Washington sent a delegation to Great Britain and negotiated Jay's Treaty, which was an attempt to resolve several lingering issues with the British. In 1797, Washington concluded his second term as president and gave his famous farewell address, warning the nations to steer clear of European alliances and conflicts and to not form political parties that will divide Americans. Our last topic in our timeline is John Adams' turbulent presidency. He would only serve 1 term, partly due to foreign policy issues that also influenced domestic actions and divided the American public. The French Revolution had many twists and turns during both Washington and Adams' presidencies. There were heated debates and divisions about whether or not to support the French Revolution or be more cozy with the British. Political parties in the United States had formed with Adams, a Federalist, taking a hard line with the French. After a foreign policy uproar with the French known as the XYZ affair, hostilities broke out between the French and United States in an undeclared and small-scale naval war called the Quasi-War. This time of war also led to domestic issues as the Federalists pushed through Congress the Alien Sedition Acts, which limited freedom of speech and citizenship. The Jeffersonian Republicans responded with the passage of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, saying that the states could nullify unconstitutional laws. The election of 1800 proved to be very divisive, as the Jeffersonian or Democratic Republicans party swept into power, ushering out the Federalists. Sometimes this is called the Revolution of 1800, and thus concludes our sweep through the Period 3 timeline.